Yeah, but you want to know if it's a journal like...
When does Mo Ali come back?
Darcy would throw you out the window for that. We'll do a paper now so you can see how we go through the positives and negatives.
I'm sorry to leave you with those two, but the next episode is very important. However, the content is super dry. We're talking Sahara Desert dry. I cannot recommend enough that you hydrate and caffeinate. This episode will really make a difference in how you answer the critical appraisal question, but enjoy.
Professor, how are you?
How's it going?
I've replaced Mo Ali.
Yeah, I'm not sure the replacement is any better or any worse, so we'll see how it goes.
We're talking about critical appraisal today.
Yeah, so critiquing a paper. It's an important part of MRCS, FRCS, and essentially life as a clinician in general, irrespective of specialty. Definitely comes up every year because you've got an academic station, but that aside, it's a skill that you're going to need lifelong.
Right.
Yeah.
So when I, just like a chest x-ray, I normally start off with the demographics of a paper. So it's who are the authors, what's the journal, and does it come from someone famous, essentially? For example, I think Mo spoke about it earlier when he was talking about the Liechtenstein Institute and hernia. So if that's an institute that's producing hernia papers, you're probably going to pay a bit more respect to it than if it's a third-year medical student who's written a case report somewhere.
Okay, so I guess what you're saying there is that you want to start off by having an overall view of what the paper is about in general terms, where it was published, what year, is the institution is coming from, or the authors.
Yeah, but you want to know if it's a journal like one of the journals, or if it's something like the British Journal of Surgery. It all depends on where it was published. And
yeah, but again, we've got to remember is that impact factor. A lot of the markers we use are not necessarily reflective.
Darcy would throw you out the window for that.
You can have good papers that are published in lower impact factor journals, and vice versa.
Yeah, of course.
For example, the paper on the link between MMR vaccine and autism, which by the way doesn't exist, was published.
A Lancet paper.
Is a Lancet paper.
Was a Lancet paper.
Was a Lancet paper, exactly. That's not to say, I guess what we're saying is you've got to have a balanced view of things.
Yeah.
And certainly going into an exam, irrespective of what you think of the paper or the institution is from, or the journal's from, whether you think they're really good or really bad, or something in between, what you want to demonstrate, especially in an exam setting, is a balanced argument, the pros and cons. So we're going to start off by saying this is a paper from, and for the purpose of the FRCS, usually the BJS, for British Journal of Surgery, from the BJS, which has got an impact factor of whatever it's going to be that year, 6, 7, 9. Yeah. So you want to talk about that this is a paper that's an observational study or randomized trial published in the journal in this year, impact factor or whatever it is. If you know, but you don't have to go and learn by heart. It's not a high yield, don't do it. Yeah. Just know things like, for example, in the surgical
if it's a good paper or a bad, if it's a good journal or bad journal.
Exactly.
That's pretty much what you need to know.
BJS is reputable. What do you usually do next? How do you critique it?
When I'm going through a paper, I think first of all, when someone says a critical appraisal, you have to bear in mind that just doesn't mean tear a paper and tear it to shreds. It means say the good things about the paper too. And I think a lot of people forget that. So when they go into talking about critical appraisal, they just say all the negative things and then ignore the fact that it's actually a double-blind RCT. You want to get an overall summary of the paper. So a good structure for that is PICO, right? So
what's PICO?
So PICO stands for population, intervention, control, or comparator, and outcome. You might not fill all of those. For example, not every study has a control or a comparator. But if you're reading a paper and you're wanting to make sure, is this paper what I actually want to read? And going through PICO very quickly will be is this the research question that I have in mind that I want to know the answer to? Is it really clearly defined? Okay. If you know it's clearly defined, you've done check one, and you know this is the paper you want to read. So you move on to the next thing. And the next thing, I don't read any of the intro. I go straight to the last paragraph, which says, what is the aim of this paper?
That's a very important point. We'll talk a little bit about how you'd present the critique back to somebody else. Right now, what we're talking about is
just going through a paper.
How you would critique it in your own head. And for the FRCS, you'll have 20-25 minutes with a piece of paper with lots of highlighters. You can do what you like with them. And this is the mechanism that you want to do. You want to go through the paper. The introduction, the most important part of the introduction.
The last paragraph, normally the last sentence.
Usually the last sentence. The aim of this study is...
That's all you need to read in the introduction.
Pretty much.
Don't bother wasting any other time. Just go straight to the section that says the aim of this paper is, the aim of the study is. That's all you need to read.
Correct. So that's the introduction done. What do you do next?
And then the bulk of the work is methods, results. That's where you need to spend most of the time. And so for this, what I do is if I've got a piece of paper in front of me, I draw a big plus, big minus, make a table.
That's exactly what I do, actually. Okay, so then you go to the methods. And
I go straight to the methods. So I do positives, negatives, so strengths and weaknesses of the paper.
Yeah, but what do you look for in a method? So, for example, what are the key things? Because there's different parts to it.
Yeah, so I normally start off by saying, what is the trial design?
Or the study
setting.
design.
The study design. So is it a randomized trial? Is it observational and later, which means case controlled or cohort? Is it systematic review? What kind of paper is it?
Right. So the first thing is, what type of study is this? Then?
And then I look at the type of study, and then the next stuff kind of depends on what kind of study it is. So for example, if it was a randomized control trial, you look at see, was it blinded? Was it double blinded, for example? If it was an observational study, is it case controlled? Is it cohort? How have they defined the cases? How have they selected the cases? What databases have they used? Those kinds of things.
And of course, there are a variety of checklists which we'll post online. There's too many to go through, but there are a variety of different checklists and kind of tools that you can use for each different type of study. For example, there's
So it's the equator network, right? Which kind of, so if it's a systematic review, let's say follow Prisma guidelines. If it's a cohort study, it's trove guidelines. If it's an RCT, it's consort guidelines. There's a guideline for anything.
JDAD, Oxford, consort.
And those are and then there's a critical appraisal checklist such as like JDAD for RCTs, Newcastle, Ottawa, all that stuff, which we'll talk about, I guess, a bit later.
And what that allows you to do is, if you are, again, you don't need to know every single bullet point of every single checklist. That's not the point.
It's a reference work.
It's a point of reference to say, look, I'm assessing the methods based on these criteria. You want to know about the population. You want to know not just what type of study it is. You want to know the population. You want to know what the intervention was, if there was one. How do they collect the data? Is it retrospective? Is it prospective? What was the follow-up like? Was it good enough time to see the outcome you want to see? And then that's the kind of execution of it. And then it's have there been confounders? Have they adjusted for those? And then we'll talk a little bit about the statistical thing as well, because there should be a little paragraph telling you what kind of statistical analysis is done. And this is the bit that people are terrified of, but actually the amount of statistics you need to know is pretty straightforward.
So you've identified the type of study it is, you've identified the flow of people or the flow of papers through that study. Have they accounted for people who've been dropped out of the study, what the statistical tests that have been done are, and you just kind of, every kind of study design has a generic set of pros and cons to it. So for example, if it's an observational trial, the natural con is that you cannot determine causality. The study design is there to be hypothesis generating, and so you come up with a study that an RCT might be able to test for causality, but this is purely describing relationships.
So causality and association are two very important parts of any kind of research. Causality is essentially one event or one intervention or one attribute, ethnicity.
It's like height being associated with shoe size, for example.
Exactly. So that is, causality must be that the A must be causing, or have a very significant influence in the causation of the outcome. That's very difficult to prove in anything other than an RCT. Association, however, is different. Association doesn't necessarily imply that this variable, whatever that is, has caused the outcome, but may be linked to it somehow. Okay, so you've done that. You've done the checklist.
Go through the statistical tests to make sure they're appropriately done, or they have some kind of statistical plan that I can make sense of. And then I go straight to the results.
Results, what do you want to know?
Now the results in the same way are, we should go back to the methods. In the methods, you then look at the inclusion, the exclusion criteria, so you know what cases have been included in the study, what have been excluded. And this is often important because if we just take the CODA trial, for example, they've excluded septic patients. Or they've excluded someone who's extremely unwell. So those patients were never going to get antibiotics in the first place. So you therefore know that trial can't be applied to that circumstance.
So you have somebody coming with peritonitis who's got secondary to appendicitis, the CODA trial probably isn't as relevant. And somebody who's got appendicitis, but they're not terribly septic and got from phosphate. So that's important. The inclusion-exclusion criteria, so just because a trial is about a topic, it doesn't necessarily mean it accounts for everything. Generalization.
Trials are normally very specific research settings. They're not normally, although they can be, they're not pragmatically designed. And so you have to take that into context. So in the results section, again, the more you read the papers, the more you realize they're very formulaic, and so they have the same structure pretty much throughout.
Yeah.
So your results.
What's the first section of the results?
Yeah, your first is going to be overall study characteristics or something like this, some kind of study demographics.
60% were male.
Yeah.
20%
They'll
were
go through-
under the age of 18, whatever. Yeah.
And they'll describe, like, if it was a systematic review, they'll describe how many papers they looked at, screened, full text reviews, excluded, all that stuff. That is your first.
So hasn't told you the first paragraph or the first one or two paragraphs doesn't really tell you about any of the outcomes that you're investigating.
It's purely the demographics.
It sets the scene that this is what the population or the number of studies you've got if it's a review. Yeah.
It's purely just and so table 1 is normally the first thing you want to quickly glance over. Table 1 basically summarizes all the demographics across the various groups in one table, so you can quickly see if there's any differences. So for example, if it's a randomized control trial, or even if it's a cohort study and you've got 2 different arms, you're looking to see if there's a difference between age, sex, BMI, ASA, any other basic demographic that you can think of across those cohorts at the beginning of the study.
Excellent. Okay, so essentially the first table is usually a reflection of what's been written in the first 1 or 2 paragraphs.
So
that's your demographic. You've set the scene.
So I go
you know
straight to the
population.
first table, have a quick look, make sure there's any differences. If there are, I keep that in mind to make sure that when they've actually reported the outcomes, they've taken those into account during the stats.
Good. Then what?
Then I go to the outcome section.
This is the meaty bit.
This is the meaty bit. Now, I think it's probably too big to give generic conclusions here because it depends on the trial type and stuff. But
Or study type, yeah.
yeah, so you just want to have a look through it and see what are the main outcomes, what are the confidence intervals, what are the standard deviations, what are the numbers if there are numbers involved.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, but essentially that's the bulk of the results is going to be in the middle section of the results.
Spend most of your time here.
Yes, spend most of your time here because this is what...
Understanding them.
Yeah, because this is what tells you that this is the answer to the last sentence of the introduction. The aim of this study is, and this is where you're going to find out if that aim has been achieved.
Yeah.
Because after this is going to be secondary outcomes or smaller things.
So primary outcomes, there's normally a line. If you really struggle to understand it, a little hack is if you go to the first paragraph of the discussion, the first paragraph of every discussion starts off the same as the principal findings of the paper.
Correct.
So if you read the first paragraph of the discussion, that will tell you overall this study found blah, 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 blah. Yeah. That is what you can then, if you're really struggling to, because some of these papers, especially the bigger impact factor journal papers, they can be quite convoluted with their results. So if you read that paragraph, you get an overall sense, and then you can go back to it and you'll be like, okay, now I can fill in the gaps.
Exactly. So you're now in the middle section of the results. And it's usually, now this could be anything from table 2 to table 5, or it could be all sorts of things, depending on what the study is. But this is where you want to make sense of what was the outcome, what was the end result of this study. Yeah. That's when your tables will help, and yes, the discussion part will help as well. But you need to have a clear idea in very simple terms. The aim of the study was drug A is better than drug B. Has that been demonstrated? You need to be able to answer that question before moving on.
Yeah. And then, so to be honest, there are times I'll read the discussion. I tend to skim read most of it. So again, the first paragraph is key. And then you can read the strengths and limitations part of it. There's normally a nice little section on the limitations part of it.
Penultimate one usually, yeah.
Yeah, it's normally is either the second last or the third last one, because one of them will be limitations of the paper, and then one of them will be future directions for the paper. Once you've got those, you're probably going to get a question at some point as to how relevant all these results are. What's the validity? What's the internal validity? What's the external validity of this paper? Mm-hmm. And so you'll be like, how does this paper change your practice, Professor Scari? Or something along those lines.
Yeah. So what's internal validity?
So internal validity is if you were to repeat your experiment several times over, would you get the same results?
Excellent. So your own study, given the parameters you've already specified, if we did this lots and lots of times, is there going to be similar results? Yeah. That's the internal. What's the external validity?
External validity is, okay, so if you've worked in Luton, is it applicable to another centre that you work in?
Yeah, exactly. Is the study, if we were to take it and try to apply it to a different setting,
will it work?
Will you find the same thing? So that's external validity. Okay, fine. And then what are you going to do?
So then you need to kind of, once you've got all those thoughts in your mind, you've summarized them, you've come up with the internal validity, external validity, you've seen the quality of the paper, you then need to kind of discuss this back. You need to articulate it.
So we've done our kind of analysis, and like yourself, I literally just have a sheet of paper that has a,
plus or minus,
could be improved, plus or minus, whatever you want to put.
Oh, one thing we should mention, funding. Always look at funding. It's going to be there in these big journals. Most of these papers are funded. It's important to recognize the role funding can play in a paper.
Yeah.
And you just have to be wary of that and know that it's not that funded studies are bad at all. You just have to know about it.
Yeah, so that's important as well. It's not a case of just because a trial or study was funded by a certain organization, whether that's a state organization, a charitable or industry organization. It doesn't necessarily mean that a bias has happened, but it should be declared. You should know about it.
Yeah.
Excellent, okay. So you've got your piece of paper with a plus sign and minus sign, but you're not going to say negative things. You're going to say what could be improved or how you would do it different. But plus and minus in 2 columns. And then the far left column is going to, I just put abstract, introduction, methods, results of discussion. Just put a couple of bullet points in each one. Before you know it, you've got a pretty comprehensive overview, or at the very least, the majority of what you need to say. And it needs to be balanced.
Yeah, so you have to mention the good and bad. And I think we'll do a paper now so you can see how we go through the positives and negatives, because we can't do it for every single study, or maybe we can at a later date. Not one of Professor Ali's case reports that we're going through.
Because that would go to New England Journal, yeah.
We'll put a link up so you can see it, and then if you want, you can pause here, go through it, and then see if we go through at the same time. But we'll go through it super quickly. So the paper's called Impact of Fatigue in Surgeons on Performance and Patient Outcome. It's a systematic review. Yes. If we start off with the demographics, this is a paper published in the British Journal of Surgery in the latest edition, published in the Netherlands. They're actually a pretty academic unit.
It's a reputable unit.
The Netherlands are a pretty reputable academic unit. Going through this paper, if we go to the last line of the introductions, the aim of the systematic review was to assess the impact of non-muscular surgeon fatigue on surgical performance. And it's both real life and simulated outcomes. So going through that PICO framework, it's targeting surgeons, it's targeting non-muscular fatigue in particular, and the outcome is looking at our surgical outcomes. Yeah,
so non-muscular, that means that's cognitive stuff, isn't it? That's how tired they are, emotionally, psychologically, decision-making, that kind of stuff.
So you go through the methods, and then you can see that this paper was registered in Prospero. So all systematic reviews have to be registered, or should be registered in Prospero. Prospero is essentially, it's not quite a search engine, it's a registry. It's a registry of systematic reviews.
It's a database, isn't it?
It's a database. And the reason it's there is before you do a systematic review, you have to go through the Prospero database to make sure no one else has done your paper. If someone has done it, what are you doing in your paper that's different and justifies its publication? So normally people will be like, you have to get a Prospero ID once you've registered your systematic review. So it's just like a protocol.
Because it also does what though? It helps with bias, doesn't it? Because you already have to declare that this is my inclusion, this is my exclusion. So, and if there's
you have to write a protocol for it, essentially.
Exactly. And if there's any change to that, there has to be a very good reason why that is. So we will put those things up on a link. But Prospero, by the way, if anybody's writing a systematic review nowadays, should absolutely is a must before they start to submit the protocol and register on Prospero. Okay, so this one they've done that. They've already highlighted, registered on Prospero. So that's a good thing.
Good thing. And the other thing that goes, so the one strand published in a good journal from an academic unit, from a robust academic unit, they've adhered to Prospero guidelines, and Prospero registry, and there's Prisma guidelines.
Excellent. So we're talking about the methods here. The good things about the methods are that they have tick, done the Prospero, they've used the appropriate validated tools like Prisma. What else is good?
So the Prisma guidelines are essentially created by something called the Equator Network, and these guys have checklists for every different study type. So if you have a study, an RCT, cohort, whatever, has to follow certain guidelines, and that's set up by the Equator Network. So then you go to the literature section, you can see, again, I go straight to the diagram because I don't have time to read.
The Prisma flowchart.
The Prisma flowchart. And so this you can see, it shows you the databases that they've used, and if they've used something called grey literature, which is something that is not easily accessible. It might not be published in what you call the database. That's Medline, Embase, any of the other
a poster presentation.
It could be a poster presentation, or if they've had to contact an author directly and get the paper from them. Like, and that's what
pros and cons of that, but that's not something you need to get.
Yeah, to be honest, it's mainly. But every paper says that you have to include grey literature. It's like grey literature is grey because it's crap. That's the reality. But anyway, and then you can also see in the literature section.
When does Mo Ali come back?
So they've got librarian support. So one of the things when you're conducting a literature search strategy is often there are specialized librarians that will do this for you. Yeah. And because this is what they do day in, day out, they're very good at it and probably better than we would be at it.
Absolutely.
So you almost outsource this part to them.
Fine.
And then you can see, because we've done enough systematic reviews, we know what each part is, and a lot of it we would probably skim through. But in general, you have multiple people reviewing the paper, or you get a subset of people that review a percentage of that paper to make sure that the data entry you're extracting is accurate, reliable.
Yeah.
And I know they've done the same thing here. In this case, what they've done is they've taken 10% of the 10% of the studies that's been extracted by one extractor, and they've got a second person to look through it. And if there are any discrepancies,
independently. So they don't confer.
Exactly, independently.
Good. Just to summarize, in their methods, the good things they've got is they've used the appropriate tools. They're looking at something that we think is important. They've explained the methodology. They've registered on Prospero, and they've used an outline or setup in the way they've written in the paper that is familiar and the right way, which is the Prisma flow chart to describe.
And Prisma flow chart's great because it just gives you a lot of detail that you can go through super quick. So you can see how many papers they excluded and for what reasons. It's really, really quick.
Excellent.
So they've broken it down to real life studies, simulated studies, and then they talk about how they put all that data together and what the risk of bias is.
Fine.
The risk of bias is essentially, there are validated tools for different study types, and there are a bunch of these. Essentially, you just need to know the names of a few of them if they're validated, is what I would guess. So Newcastle Ottawa is a really common one that's used for cohort-style studies, observational-style studies. Cochrane risk of bias is often one that's used for RCTs, but there's JADAD score that's used for RCTs. There's plenty, as long as they've used something.
Exactly. So it doesn't really matter which one they've used as long as one of these validated checklists. And there are loads. Exactly. So they've done that as well. And then they've talked about the stats. And the stats.
So in this paper, so they've done that. They've talked about the outcomes and how they've measured them and how clearly defined they are, which is really important because if you've got outcomes, you want to know that they're all looking at the same thing.
Yes.
And when it comes to the stats of this paper, they've said something about the heterogeneity of it. So what's heterogeneity, Prof? Heterogeneity
is, as the name would suggest, is differences in the way the results have been reported in each individual paper. This is only, there's different types of heterogeneity, of course, but we're talking in the context of a systematic review and meta-analysis. Heterogeneity in the context of a systematic review means that the studies have either got different populations in them or they've come up with different results, or both.
They vary to such a great extent. What this paper says is that it's very difficult to collate the results and do a meta-analysis, which is where you take the raw numbers, combine them together to give you an overall number of a size of effect, essentially. Yeah. And they can't do that. So that's a limitation that you've noticed already in the data across the studies that they've looked at differs so much that it's not possible to pool them, but they've acknowledged this. And they've also excluded from the trials, if any of those studies had high risk of bias from the tools, and they used Newcastle Ottawa score in this for that, and for the RCT they used Cochrane risk of bias, they've excluded that from the analysis.
Fine. So it's important to know that, especially in the context of a systematic review, that it's not just a case of just having an inclusion-exclusion criteria and getting any old paper and just vaguely fits that and just jam in. Remember, in a systematic review, you are completely at the mercy of what's been published.
Yeah.
You didn't do these studies. You've got no say in how it's already done. It's historic. It's published. It's done. Time's moved on. So then you've got to be sensible about what you're going to choose, and you've got to be really strict that you adhere to your inclusion-exclusion criteria.
And the quality assessment is rigid.
And the quality assessment. Now, with this kind of study, one of the issues are, of course, how do you measure fatigue or tiredness? That's not physical. Even physical tiredness, how do you measure it? It's quite difficult. And the surgeons will be from different age groups, different cultures, different backgrounds, night or day, different types of operation.
Yeah.
So there's a massive amount of clinical heterogeneity here.
Exactly. So if we go to the results, you can see that they've got measures. So they've essentially split them up into simulated and real life scenarios.
Yes.
And we're not going to read the whole thing, but essentially each of those has a different defining point and a different definition that they've measured. And the way they've measured outcomes of fatigue differ. So for some studies, it's a questionnaire. For other studies, they made them perform certain simulated tasks. Most of them were laparoscopic.
Yeah.
Most of them were laparoscopic. Some of them were not tying. And for other ones, they actually used pupillometry, so like eye movements and stuff like this.
So this is a very important part of the methods, isn't it? We've talked about the good things of the methods, and there's lots of really good things, but there are some limitations. One of the main limitations of what you've just highlighted is the heterogeneity. You've got massive amount of difference between the different studies in how they've defined tiredness, how they have measured it, the different tools they've used, and they're across different time periods in different countries for different operations. Some are laparoscopic, some are open, some are not even general surgical.
So you've already got like the niches that that's developed here, because it's not going to be applicable to every scenario. Now, the results here are interesting, and I'm just going to give a broad overview.
So any further limitations of the
Plenty, but
methods before we go on? 'Cause we want to go on. So what other limitations are there? We'll talk about the.
So one of the
we mentioned results, but tell me we said lots of good things about the methods. What limitations are there in the methods?
So one of the big limitations here is data capture. The data capture here is, if you think of fatigue as a metric, and you take a snapshot and you say, okay, this person was tired. Immediately when they were tired, we made them do a task, an operation, or they were doing an operation, whatever. You then look at the outcomes of that section. But what you don't do is, let's say you're on call, you're tired, you've been on call, you finished your laparotomy, you've gone home, but then you've got to come back the next day. You're still fatigued, but what about now? What about your decision making? How do you even assess decision making appropriately? The long-term effects of that are very difficult to do, but it's not even something they talk about in this paper.
Yeah.
So that's a major limitation.
Exactly. And the other thing is, how do you know I'm tired? What's tired? There's degrees of severity, right?
Yeah.
And what are the other things? What are the other confounds that can affect
Sleep,
it?
for example. Sleep is the big
sleep.
one.
Just getting stuck in traffic.
Yeah.
And
like, how does that slow your decision making down? How are you with your peers that day? There's a bunch of other things that are important. Look, you can't test for everything in a paper, but these are things to talk about as some of the limitations of the study and some of the confounders that haven't been included.
Exactly. How many buckets of coffee, of your expensive coffee that you've had from Waitrose or wherever it is that you buy?
Dishwater kits that you've had from Costa.
There's a lot of confounders that can't be controlled.
Yeah.
There is difficulty in measuring the outcome, and there are confounders in that actually by just making them do the task of measuring it can have an impact on the result itself. So the kind of Hawthorne effect is well observed by as well. Okay, so that's the limitations of the methods.
Yes.
Results.
So the results here is that I think.
Good points.
So let's talk about the simulated studies first. I think about nearly 50% said there was some negative effect on performance from the fatigue. I think there was one study that showed an improvement. So they showed that, and they said that was probably because of the fact that they were more aware, they had good coping mechanisms.
Running on adrenaline, yeah.
And then the rest of it were kind of neither here nor there.
Yeah.
The problem is that they also report that it's a huge variation. It's very difficult to give you exact parameters. And as we said, it's just a snapshot. You don't know what's happening. Okay, you're tired, you've done your procedure, fine. Okay, maybe even the one study that said, you know what, things were really good, we were more focused, fine. But human psychology, human sleep function means that there has to be a crash.
Yeah.
So how do you measure for that crash when it will happen?
Or it could have been a more straightforward procedure, right? How do you measure?
Maybe you're just having to do some easy procedure. Also, this is a lot of the work was looking at laparoscopic work.
Yeah.
What about if you're doing something that's not a laparoscopic procedure?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely.
Like a lipoma excision.
Yeah, so the good things about the results are, but in the paper, the good things about the result, what have they done well?
So they've had very clear defined outcomes.
Yep.
They've also done a very good thing of, they appreciate the limitations of the work.
Excellent.
They mention that.
So let's just go from the top. First of all, they have tackled or tried to tackle a topic that's actually important.
Huge. It's a huge topic. It's important. It's huge. It's
big
well defined.
Topic. It's well defined. They've got inclusion, exclusion criteria, and which they've stuck to, and they've also
assessed the quality.
Yeah, and they've assessed the quality. They've also been sensible in the way they've been realistic in the way they've said, look, we're not going to lump all these things together because there could be differences. And they've also presented it, I think, in a very clear way. The tables are clear, the flow chart is clear, the charts are clear.
Diagrams are nice.
It's very nice, and it's not too difficult to understand. They haven't, like you say, gone in a very convoluted way. They've been quite direct.
It's a systemized paper. It's nicely written.
Excellent. So there's 4 or 5 bullet points you've already got in the results section, and we can put them in on so you can see how we've done it. What are the things that you would have done differently, or what are the problems with the negative, or whatever you want to say?
I think I think as you said, in systematic review, you're limited by the quality of the existing literature.
Yeah.
So I couldn't have done anything differently with the existing literature, and I don't think I would have changed anything with the way they've done the paper. I think it's actually well written.
Yeah.
The only thing from my point of view is the risk of bias in a supplementary table, which pisses me off, because you then have to open up like a third Word document, whereas like if it was at the end of this, it'd be easier. That's the only thing. I wouldn't even mention that.
There's a generational difference between us, I find. It's like clicking on a PDF is extra work for you, is it? Okay.
So then the real life studies, they found a similar thing, but they found actually about 10% of them had an improvement. It wasn't just the one study. There was a few more studies that showed a bit of an improvement. But again, there was a similar split between some studies found that there was an equivocal difference or like it was very difficult to measure, and some found it worse.
So what's the problem with the results? Which not necessarily with the study itself, but just the literature, the outcome.
We don't know.
We don't know. That's the problem.
That's the conclusion.
Exactly. We haven't definitively answered
The questions. Which is, and sometimes people do this very deliberately, as I've done in my thesis, because you do it deliberately to show there isn't enough literature which justifies you running a trial.
Yeah, because if you're going to say something definitive on something so big and so groundbreaking, you've got to have really good evidence to stick your neck out there. And they haven't done that, which in a way is good. They haven't committed themselves saying, there's definitely a difference.
In fact, what they've said is that future work needs to look at having a more robust and uniform way of measuring fatigue and so. And you can, if you know a bit about this, you can talk. You can talk about. You can include eye movements in the future. If you're using robotic surgery, you could track movements very precisely.
Absolutely. You
could then run big data on it. You can run machine learning. Like depending on where your mind goes with
all
this,
sorts of things,
you can talk about whatever you want.
But have an objective assessment that is reproducible.
Yeah,
agreed, and easy to do. The downside, however, of the paper as well, and again, this is not a critique of the paper itself, but it's because of the published literature that's out there. We're not really any the wiser at the end.
And I think you're probably going to get something along the lines of how is it going to change your practice, or what would you take away from this study?
Yeah.
And
well, before we do that, let's go to the discussion and talk about the good things and the
so discussion. If you go through the first paragraph, as we say, it very neatly summarizes everything. So it actually does say that about 50% of the study shows that when there's fatigue present, you get worse outcomes. The anatomy of a discussion is your first paragraph goes through the overall findings or the principal findings, and then your subsequent paragraphs go through some of the more nuanced points, and you compare that to the existing literature. Then you've got a paragraph on limitations, then you've got a paragraph on future directions, then you've got a conclusion paragraph. That's normally a structure of every discussion. Yeah.
What you want to look for in a discussion is, have they got that summary paragraph at the beginning? Have they got a sensible conclusion they've drawn as a result of the whole thing, which they have here, I think? And have they talked about enough of the limitations, which they have? So done those things very, very well. And then the other thing is the bit in the middle, the 3 or 4 paragraphs and wedged in the middle of these extremes, is have they discussed all the nuanced points that in the literature about all the things we talked about? How many cans of Red Bull and coffee have influenced
how you measure sleep, what scales have they used, what the limitations of those scales are.
Have their children kept them waking?
Exactly. Do they have new kids?
Exactly.
And there's no funding for this paper, and they've talked about the acknowledgements and everything there.
And that's what we want to look at. And they've done all of that very well. What do you think is the limitations of the discussion?
So I think the limitation of this discussion is based around the quality of the included literature.
Yeah.
That's the limitation. And the fact that every study has used so many diverse outcome variables because they've used a different scale or they've used a different way of measuring fatigue. And it's difficult to measure fatigue. It's difficult to account for other confounders, sleep, coffee intake, all those things. And in a systematic review, you're trying to collate that across all the papers. And so some papers might talk about it, other papers might not even mention it. And then you have to make that quality assessment on that paper. So that's the thing. I think the discussions, it's very appropriate.
I agree.
There's nothing that, it's a good paper.
I think it's a good paper as well. I agree.
And then you'd say, how would this change your practice?
How would it change? That's the key question. How would you change your practice? What would you do differently?
I would say the common sense thing is that fatigue affects your decision making. It probably affects the way you handle complex tasks. If I were a surgeon, I would say it probably handles my psychomotor skills too. But also, it's the fact that when I said, what would you take away from this? It would probably be the awareness of how fatigue affects colleagues. So if someone's come off an on-call and their handover, and the handover is not as, they're not sharp, but they've just done they might have been awake all night.
So I think that's very important, is that awareness and just putting the issue in the forefront is important, because I think that's one thing that traditionally maybe in medicine, not just in surgery, in medicine overall.
Surgery's for this, man. Unless you're Professor Ali, who's been asleep on the couch because the SHO has been running ragged across the hospital. Most people have been,
it's no longer on the couch now. I think it's got water better here. But it's But the important thing is that actually I think medicine as a whole has realized, just like any other kind of, whether it's a cognitive workload or physical or both, that there is a finite amount of kind of reserve that each of us has, which can change from day to day depending on how much rest we've had, how our own emotional states, how much more decisions we've had to make. And And
It's an emerging
lots of other-
area of literature,
Exactly.
I think,
So
within...
it's an important
Yeah.
topic. How would it change? Yeah, like you say, having a greater awareness of yourself and colleagues, and just having a topic being discussed is important.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we going to do something completely dramatically different? Loaded
No.
question. We're not. The answer, if it's an exam setting, the answer is almost always never, because we don't have a robust evidence one way or the other, and we don't really know what tools are likely to combat that
Yeah.
fatigue to make us better decisions.
It's just about being aware of it and the fact that this is probably an emerging area of literature that's going to just
Yeah.
increase in the future. From an FRCS perspective, what other questions would they ask around critical appraisal?
The critical appraisal bit, that's pretty much all. What ultimately they want to know is, have you been able to read and interpret this paper and make sense of it? As in, what's the message here? And what are the good things about it, and what are the things that could be... That's all they're looking for. It's not a case of just saying they've already decided this is a good paper, so if you say it's not so good, it's a fail, or vice versa. It's not about that. It's about saying, look, these are the good things, these are the things that could be improved, and some of the things that cannot be improved because that's the nature of the methodology. It is what it is. It's just, what they want you to know is, are you aware of these things? That's the key thing.
Fine.
It's not about knowing the nuances of maths and hierarchical regression, and it's not about that. It's about knowing, does this clinician understand what this paper is about, with all the good and all the not so good things? That's it. And that's why having that table with those 3 columns, abstract, introduction, methods, results, discussion,
Is a nice way of doing
good
it.
and good and bad points, or negative and positive, whatever you want to do, having 2 or 3 bullet points in each, that's all you need.
Right.
Then in the end, it's about having a way of, like everything in the FRCS or any exam, is having a way of concisely and clearly relaying it back to the examiner.
Good.
I think
And we should let's go have some Aldi coffee.
Let's do it.